In the heart of a quiet suburban neighborhood, there stood a supermarket, perfectly ordinary in appearance, but cursed by something sinister lurking beneath its fluorescent lights and well-stocked shelves. Most people in the town of Clearwood didn't know or care about the history of the land it was built on. The land had been an old farmstead, where dark rituals were rumored to have taken place decades ago. But all that had been bulldozed into memory, replaced by the gleaming aisles of consumer goods. James Bentley, a night shift worker barely scraping by, had worked at the store for 3 years. It was a dead-end job, the kind where the hours dragged like chains. But he needed it. He was alone. His wife had left him after years of frustration with his dwindling ambition, and his son barely spoke to him. The supermarket was all he had left. At least it was quiet on the night shift, especially after midnight when no customers ever came. It was just him and the shelves. That Friday night, something felt off the moment James clocked in. The automatic doors slid open, and a gust of cold air greeted him, colder than usual for an August evening. The fluorescent lights flickered as he walked through the empty aisles to the employee break room. Nobody else was scheduled to work that night. The lone janitor had called out sick, and his manager, Mr. Wilson, insisted that he could manage closing the place alone. The first couple of hours passed as usual. James busied himself restocking shelves, rearranging displays, and listening to the faint hum of the cooling units that kept the freezers from frosting over. The hum, though, began to get under his skin. It seemed louder than usual, like a distant drone rising in intensity, even though the store was deathly quiet. He shrugged it off and continued stacking cans of soup. Around midnight, the lights flickered again, but this time they dimmed for a second too long. The store plunged into darkness before the lights buzzed back on, casting everything in a washed-out, unnatural glow. James looked around, heart racing. He laughed at himself nervously. The lights always did that now and then. "Cheap wiring," he muttered. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something move at the far end of the aisle. A shadow, brief, subtle, but unmistakable, slipped between the shelves. His pulse quickened, and his skin prickled with a cold sweat. There shouldn't have been anyone else in the store. "Hello?" James called out, his voice echoing unnaturally in the cavernous space. No response came. The supermarket was equipped with cameras, but the monitors were all in the manager's office, and James didn't feel like walking all the way there just to confirm he was alone. He grabbed his box cutter, just in case, and cautiously moved toward the back of the store. As he turned the corner into the frozen foods section, he froze. There, standing at the far end of the aisle, was a woman. She wore a tattered coat, her back turned toward him. Her long, matted hair draped over her shoulders like a dark veil, and her head was slightly cocked, as if she was listening to something James couldn't hear. "Ma'am," he said, gripping the box cutter a little tighter. "We're closed. You're gonna have to leave." The woman didn't move. James hesitated, his feet rooted to the spot as a chill slithered up his spine. Something was deeply wrong. He swallowed hard and took a step forward, his shoes squeaking against the tiled floor. "Did you hear me?" James asked, louder this time. "You can't be in here." The woman moved at last, but not the way James expected. Her body twitched, like a puppet being jerked by invisible strings. Her head rotated slowly, unnaturally far, until she was staring at him with wide, dead eyes. Her mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin, revealing rows of blackened teeth. James stumbled back, his heart hammering against his ribs. The woman took a step forward, her limbs jerking in unnatural angles as though she were a marionette controlled by a clumsy hand. "Help!" Me, she rasped, but the voice wasn't her own. It was distorted, deep, as though it came from somewhere far beneath the earth. Then she screamed, a high-pitched, soul-piercing wail that made James's blood curdle. In a blind panic, he bolted. His feet slapped against the floor as he ran through the aisles, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. The scream echoed through the store, bouncing off the walls like it was following him. He reached the front of the store, frantically pushing at the automatic doors, but they didn't budge. The lights above flickered again, casting eerie shadows across the glass doors. No, 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 no! James banged on the glass, desperation rising in his throat. He turned to look back, his eyes scanning the aisles, but the woman was nowhere to be seen. The store was silent again, unnaturally so. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath. James's hands trembled as he pulled his phone from his pocket, but when he glanced at the screen, it was blank. The battery had been at 80% earlier, but now it was dead. A low hum filled the air again, this time louder, more oppressive, almost suffocating. It vibrated through the walls, the floor, and into his bones. Suddenly, the fluorescent lights flickered once more, but this time, they didn't come back on. The entire store was swallowed in darkness, save for the faint emergency lights that cast long, distorted shadows on the walls. And then he saw them. Figures. Dozens of them. All standing silently at the end of the aisles, their faces obscured by the gloom. Their bodies were misshapen, like mannequins left in the sun too long, warped and grotesque. James's breath caught in his throat as the figures began to move, slowly and deliberately, their steps synchronized like a grotesque parade. James backed away until he bumped into the counter at the front of the store. His hands fumbled beneath the register, looking for something, anything he could use as a weapon. His fingers wrapped around a flashlight, and he flicked it on, sweeping the beam across the store. The figures were gone. But just as his heart began to slow, he heard a sound that made his skin crawl. A faint whispering, like wind moving through dead trees. He turned the flashlight toward the nearest aisle, and there, crouched low to the ground, was the woman again. Her limbs were twisted at sickening angles, her wide grin splitting her face unnaturally. Her dead eyes locked onto his, and she started to crawl toward him, her movements quick and insect-like. James screamed and ran for the employee exit at the back of the store. His footsteps echoed in the oppressive silence, but the whispering followed him, growing louder, more insistent. He fumbled for the keys at his waist, his fingers shaking as he reached the door. He shoved the key into the lock and turned it, but the door wouldn't open. Behind him, the crawling sound grew louder. James turned around, his heart pounding in his throat. The woman was gone again, but the whispering remained, filling his ears, filling his mind. It was as if the entire store was alive with it, the voices of 1,000 tormented souls pressing in on him from all sides. In a last desperate attempt, James threw his shoulder against the door, and it finally gave way. He tumbled out into the night, gasping for air, and scrambled to his feet. The supermarket loomed behind him, silent and dark, but the whispering persisted. Faint now, but still there, lingering in the back of his mind. He ran to his car, started it with shaking hands, and sped away, glancing in the rearview mirror. The store faded into the distance, but something else caught his eye. In the back seat, reflected in the dim light of the dashboard, was the woman, her twisted grin staring back at him. And then, the whispering began again. The supermarket never reopened. The building was abandoned, left to rot, as rumors spread through Clearwood about the horrors that had taken place there. But James Bentley was never seen again. Some say he drove off into the night, escaping whatever haunted that place. But others say the supermarket claimed him, just like it had claimed so many before him. And if you drive past the empty building late at night, you might still hear the faint sound of whispering, carried on the wind. Feel off, thanks for watching, and I see you in the next terror.